Is a great quote. I've been using a lot lately. It's from Dilbert. It goes, "Change is good. You go first."
Welcome to another deep dive episode of the Most Modern Podcast. In a lot of our conversations, we mentioned the enormous impact policy has on cities. We took an opportunity to dive into how cities like New York, Boston, and Hong Kong are legislating for the environmental challenges we're facing. We hope you enjoy.
Is a great quote. I've been using a lot lately. It's from Dilbert. It goes, "Change is good. You go first." And I think that's sort of emblematic in a lot of situations here. The thing, though, that's quite interesting is that, there are certain things you can learn. I think it's actually based on latitude. So however far north or however far south you are, it doesn't matter which part of the globe you're on, you're going to have a similar climate. So, the dry areas of California are also, they're similar to what you get in the Mediterranean or in Australia, for instance. The tropics are dealing with very similar conditions, so you can kind of learn from one another. And then the longitudinal portions that the indicator that matters is how close you are to or from water, and if you're at risk for flooding or for storm events like that. So on one hand, I do think that people will start to take note, but on the other hand, I do get a sense that it also really depends on the context, because what is palatable in one place may not be palatable in another place because of lifestyle, because of the architecture, because of the existing built environment.
Yeah.
I don't know if we can all be like the Netherlands.
Yeah, I mean, a few months back when I was in Korea, I was still very surprised that the buildings there, even the new constructions, no matter of how big or small they are, it's all still poured in place concrete, no insulation at all, and just whatever siding, just slap on it. And that to me, now that I have a little bit more knowledge in terms of how buildings are insulated and how they breathe and so on and so forth, I can't believe that's still going on, and no one really talks about, what's the carbon emission of this building? Like, how do you reduce that? And I don't know when that will start at actually. Like, even for such developed countries like Korea, they don't have any standards in from my knowledge. You're in Hong Kong, Alex. Are you seeing anything different?
I mean, on one hand, in Asia, you build in concrete. There's a lot of reasons why. One is there isn't a lot of lumber to be had. I think the construction methods are just tried and true. In Hong Kong, for instance, you need the concrete if you want to build super tall, like all these buildings are. So on one hand, I think that sometimes you have to, if you're going to build dense, I think concrete makes sense. But if you're going to build sparsely, maybe not. But to answer your question about when things will change, I actually think it's a bit like human beings. It'll change when the cost of not changing exceeds the cost of changing. And it's a bit hard, because I think the main concern about climate change is that if you act too late, it'll literally be too late. So I don't know. I mean, I see a lot of initiatives here, and I was just in Europe too. I was in Copenhagen, and there it seems like there's already a societal value about getting along and having a built environment that is cohesive and harmonious, which involves having a strong relationship with the water, making sure that you can get around easily. So in that case, you have bike paths everywhere. That's perfect, zero emissions. I do think that culture just plays a huge part in this, and this is maybe why for some it's a little bit intimidating, because that's actually the hardest thing to change. It's like how people act, not just like what people do, and how people build necessarily, but sort of what they choose to do when no one tells them. So, and I think if you look geopolitically, like Europe is for sure leading the way in terms of ecological and environmental policy. The US is sort of like laissez-faire. We'll see, and we'll do what we want. And the rest of the world is still kept.
Yeah, but it's, this uneven distribution, right? Like GDP is higher in Europe, in the US, quality of life is higher. It's more advanced for countries even like Korea, maybe China, Japan, maybe even. Is like the industrialization happened much later. And one of these things is like a lot of what you do to make yourself more sustainable, lower your emissions, has to do with a much higher capital cost of building. And that in a way will stifle some of the growth that these countries are looking for, right? So, in the case of Korea, probably it's like you do need more buildings, you do need more housing. And if you're going to add extra costs on top of that, it's going to stagnate your country's growth. And the government has to take that into account, right? You have to get to a point where you can actually spend money and time on these requirements, not at the expense of the quality of life for people. Right?
Yeah, and I think in Korea's case, being too advanced in a specific product type, in this case, concrete building, like they they can build like 3 floors in one day in concrete. And that's the speed of things. But when it comes to timber, the good alternative, I think Japan has much more experience in building with timber and even taller structures. And when you bring that idea, try to do that in Korea, I just heard about like a cross-laminated timber construction going bankrupt, and also like even finding difficulty working or finding a structural engineer who knows how to deal with timber structures. So it's just not a thing there. It's too early. But in the US's context, like things are different. So I guess
the US is having problems too there, right? Like Europe is probably the most mature in terms of having the whole industry built around being able to use wood products for buildings. Like I think you can look at a lot of startups that are trying to enter that space that are having enormous difficulty, one, finding people, two, finding local building code and legislation that would allow them to build these structures, and three, like suppliers. Like I've heard that, these companies are shipping things from Europe in order to build here because the manufacturing in America just doesn't meet the tolerances, doesn't meet the speed, just can't really operate at the capacity that's necessary to actually roll these things out at scale.
Yeah, in Massachusetts case, the tall timber structures, it's not up to building code, so we're still waiting for it to be adapted. It's built, but the developer means that the developer went an extra step and asked for a variance to build taller timber, and they give out variances, but it's in the works. So I'm sure that the 2021 or 2022 IBC will be adapted soon, and in that there are already changes, but it's just a slow process.
One way of looking at this whole situation is maybe that there's a lot of technological innovation that needs to occur just for the sake of making sure things are more sustainable. And as we talk about a lot of times, if we compare a building to an iPhone, if you mess up a phone and it doesn't work, okay, you have one phone, you throw it away. But if you have a building that fails, you have a huge problem. It's a public safety issue. And so in this sense, I do think that the speed at which we can expect innovation to occur in the built environment relative to consumer products or other sort of technologies is just going to naturally be slower because of the public nature of it. But maybe that's a good reason why we should actually accept and maybe understand the importance of legislation or that would push this forward, because it's not necessarily the market that would do it. And therefore it is slightly different. So requirements, things that actually I get kind of that make my life more difficult, like the California Title 24 Part 6, which requires all sorts of energy efficient fixtures and make sure that the buildings are airtight and that they're not leaking too much AC or whatnot. Those sort of things are actually important because, I wouldn't use those naturally because it would be more expensive for the project. So maybe it's legislation in this case. I'm a pretty laissez-faire type of person, but maybe in this case it's actually really helpful.
Well, to your back to your analogy, Alex, about the iPhone and a building, I think a building is also iPhone is quick and innovative. Buildings are slow, but because it's slow, it can be changed over time and it can be retrofitted. So I think a good chunk of the argument and the problem that we're facing in the built environment in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 emissions, is I think the large chunk of that is actually tackling how to retrofit buildings, because you're never going to demolish everything and rebuild everything. And, as we all know, things cover for what is it, 70% of all of the CO2 emissions. Retrofitting, finding out a best way to retrofit buildings is an issue for not just the developer and builders, but also for the cities as well. And I think there are going to be more and more incentives out there.
Yeah, but this is maybe where Europe is just ahead of the game, because they have had to constantly retrofit buildings over the years, especially in the later half of the 20th century after the war. And so maybe they're just sort of better at it, more used to it. I think the builders are definitely more used to adding new to old things, which is something that doesn't happen in a lot of places. Even in Japan, you don't really do that much. Actually, you just kind of get rid of the buildings. Most buildings are not built to last that long. And in places, sort of built out urban centers in America, like New York and Chicago, you do need to retrofit. But if you think about a place like Los Angeles, the city's not even 100 years old, really. It is technically, but it didn't really grow until the 50s and 60s. And I think you can make the case for a lot of the world, especially the so-called developing world. Those cities have been built for emerge for a long time.
Yeah, but in a way, like retrofits can get really expensive, right? Sometimes, as we heard from, I think Evan Smith in the first season, sometimes it's just easier and better to build from the ground up. So it's a tough balance to strike. I think Europe also has an advantage where there's a lot of attention paid to like heritage and preservation of old buildings. But I think if you look at, I guess, in the US, right, like maybe it is just better. If we're going to go for these aggressive goals, that might just be something we have to take on the chin and just know that some buildings are just not going to be worth the retrofit cost.
Yeah. I mean, one challenge is that, especially when you have a market-driven built environment like in America, who takes the risk on? At the end of the day, it's whoever pays the bill is the person who's going to have to enact it. So if it's a single landlord, they're going to have to make these adjustments themselves. I think that maybe those type of people that looks for subsidies from the government or some sort of assistance, or at least maybe have the government kind of get out of their way so that any sort of a retrofit could be done seamlessly or it could be done quickly. So you don't have to wait for approval and spend a lot of money to kind of applying for something and getting entitled in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's where the policy comes in, where the city or the state or the federal comes in. So maybe we can start from here, our episode, and talk about the actual subject of this.
I've been talking like we've been going, but let's introduce some of the policies maybe that we.
Yeah. So I think on my side, I feel like the big topic in the U.S. is the Inflation Reduction Act. I think it has a lot of subsidies for clean energy, a lot of grants for climate action, and one of the big ones is the Climate Action Plan. It's a $5 billion grant to the states with $250 million in the beginning stage for planning and 4.6 for implementation. So it has kind of already gone underway. Earlier this March, 45 states have submitted their initial action plan. And this is just basically telling the federal government, hey, this is what we're about to do. And this is how we could hit kind of these goals. So for New York specifically, there's some pretty aggressive goals that they're going for. And I think as we'll learn later in the sustainability season, how feasible these goals are kind of a question mark. But they're looking for an 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and 70% renewable energy by 2030, which is a pretty insane milestone.
So that includes existing buildings?
Yes.
So
yes.
All the buildings in New York have to reduce that much.
Well, not all buildings. Everything taken together has to be an 85% reduction, which is still kind of a pretty crazy target. But I think it's one of these things where building emissions are unevenly represented, so it's much more intense in urban scenarios, but transportation is much more intense in suburban scenarios, and that's one of the things that might play out in this trajectory is like, do we get more urbanization, but we need heavier building reductions, or do we get more suburban sprawl, but more transportation reductions? Because actually those two things, so part of this report, they also have to put out a greenhouse gas inventory annually. So in New York, it's done by the Department of Environmental Conservation. And the two biggest categories are buildings and transportation. So buildings come in at 63.13 million metric tons, and transit is at 63.5. So they're super close. But together, they're 3/4 of New York State's total emissions. So these are the two big categories that they're going to have to punch at.
Yeah, New York is interesting because it's really cold in the winter and it's really hot in the summer. So heating and cooling also create a huge impact on the energy bill. But it's also a place where I guess what percent of New York State lives in New York City? Like a third. Most people in New York are moving around by public transportation, right? They don't have their own vehicles. So that actually increases the sort of sustainability of that lifestyle.
New York has probably one of the oldest public transportation systems in the US. And I think, I live next to a rail yard, and when I look out, they have these like giant diesel engines just parked out there on the whole time because they can't shut them down and then restart them before the end of day kind of commute. So electrifying kind of the whole system is going to be a huge task that, as we know how the MTA works in New York, it's not going to be the easiest or the most cost-efficient effort that we'll see.
Yeah, you got to start with trash cans, and then you can move on to electrifying the whole system. New York is an important example because a lot of times as New York goes, so does the rest of the country. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's an exceptional city. It's not like anywhere else. But if things can work there, I think then people see the sort of market applicability in other places too. And you really do have to make sure that things are pretty resilient and sound in order for them to work in New York, because there's a lot of challenges that you face.
Yeah, I think one thing that we touched upon last episode is how do the states and the federal government kind of work together in order to advance some of these things. And I think in the climate action plan is one of these instances where you see how kind of the funding gets distributed into the states. I think in New York in particular, the local government is like passing on almost the responsibility to the individual owners and developers. So there's two local laws that kind of feed into the climate action plan. One is local law 84. So this happened a few years ago. It requires all buildings above 50,000 square feet to track their energy, water, and waste consumption through the EPA's Energy Star Portfolio Manager. So that's a federal program, and it kind of not only establishes a database of basically buildings around the US and their relative consumptions, but also provides the baseline for additional policies. So it's one of these things where you have to know what you don't know before you design things in order to, I guess, fix what you don't know. And Local Law 97 is something that happened much more recently, working off of the work of Local Law 84. And it again passes the responsibility onto building owners. So if you have a building over 25,000 square feet, you're going to need to meet new energy efficiency greenhouse gas emission limits starting at 2025, but with stricter limits kind of being phased in at 30, 35, 40, or 50 to kind of hit that 2050 climate goal. And the way it works is on a multiplier based on the square footage of your building. So based on building type, you have a emissions limit that is multiplied by your square footage to kind of get you to that cap. But if you're over that cap, your fine, your civil penalty is also a multiplier of that square footage. So, and the non-compliance fine is also up to that. So one of these things is like owners have to get much smarter about their building square footage. The accuracy matters a lot more, but also they, based on the size of their building, have to make in a way a matching investment for the next 40 years to try to hit those goals at those targets.
Well, Boston has a similar way of dealing with it, but it comes with a more ambitious goal to meet net zero in 2050, starting from next year. So in Boston's case, they call it the Building Emissions Reduction and Disclosure Ordinance. And like New York, it sets a baseline for the building size, which in Boston's case is 20,000 square feet or 15 or more units for residential uses. But then I think it's more of a carrot and stick approach. They also provide and link building owners to incentives coming from the state through Mass Save and also some other alternative funding sources. They also created some internal funds called the Mass Community Climate Bank, and then they also connect you to federal and state sources like federal solar tax credits, Fannie Mae's multifamily green loans. So they do supply support, but then, as you said, in terms of a stick approach, if you can't meet those goals, that gets upgraded every 5 years, starting from 2025. You'll have to cover up for the differences. So if you're not meeting that standard or requirement of the CO2 emission goal, you need to pay $234 for every metric ton above the requirement. So I think there's similar ways of approaching it, but of course all the responsibility of taking action is put on the owners.
Is this going to create another layer of compliance that building owners have to adhere to, in the sense that they have to make sure that they specifically report how much CO2 they're creating? It sounds like taxes to me. It sounds like being truthful on your accounting. And I'm wondering what other mechanisms are used to make sure that people are being honest.
Well, when measuring it, of course, it requires a third party. So the owner needs to hire a third party to do the reporting to the city. And the state also has a manager, a designated staff to review those numbers. So I don't think the owners can just like nudge it, you know. So there is be clear on your numbers, and also they give you some educational processes. They designate a staff for you if you want to learn more about it. So the information is out there. I guess it's just when would the owners take action, and not all owners are institutional owners who think about buildings all the time, right? Like there are business owners that are busy with other stuff. So I guess after doing some research on what Boston's doing and what Cambridge is doing, I think they're doing an amazing job, but the subject itself is very broad, and the audience, they're not really paying attention yet.
Another aspect that is going to be a running theme, I think, as we get to the guest episodes of the sustainability season, is the difference between embodied and operational carbon. So, embodied carbon is what comes before as we kind of get the materials for the building. That's a lot harder to determine. It has a ton of variability. But operational carbon, in a way, is built off of this foundation of buildings starting to already track their consumption. So, you pay for energy, you pay for fuel, you pay for water, you pay for waste. So there is already financial accounting happening at those levels. So you just kind of need to upgrade those operations to a level where you're now, adding additional numbers on that. And I think from a state level, right, they also have to require, energy generation, these folks to give building owners the right information in order to make that calculation. So in a way, like the foundation is already there. It's not that much harder to make that additional leap, but this is definitely an incentive for them to make that change in order to get to that reporting level where they can demonstrate compliance there.
Well, I mean, we always talk about how complex buildings are, and it seems like it's getting more complex. And I think I can't say that's a good thing, to be honest. It's already quite complex and it's difficult. I think it's necessary, absolutely. But I do wonder what the best mechanism is to make sure that people adhere and actually comply with these sorts of things. I wonder, for instance, how much of this, I had talked about how maybe it's helpful to have some sort of authority tell us what we should do. At the same time, the effects of these are going to be felt by individuals. And I'm curious how much of legislation these days is actually decided in a more kind of democratic manner, or is it something that's just authorized by governing bodies? Usually at the end of the day, it's the government that has to foot the bill for any sort of cataclysm or any sort of tragic event. So I do admit that it might be helpful for them to be able to make some of these decisions, but it's very, very murky right now. Yeah, are you guys aware of like how these legislations are being made?
Well, I guess in New York, we're definitely not voting on it. That's for sure. The representatives in the state and local government, I think in the, what's it called? Climate Act of 2020, kind of in that moment, the state and city decided to establish a 22-member Climate Action Council. And that is the people who kind of decide on what are these kind of legislations that are being passed out. So it's not this thing, maybe it's different in California where you get a lot more kind of local access to voice your opinion on some of these things that get passed. But at least in New York, it seems like the average citizen doesn't get that much of a say other than voting for the representative that may represent their interests.
Yeah, in Boston's case, they bring along the community, and they also hear from the community by involving them and asking for participation. But similar to the community meetings for new construction projects, these meetings happen either during the workday, in the work hours, or at like 6 p.m. in the evening, which it calls for specific people who has enough time and energy to attend. And I don't know if that's enough to either creating awareness for the people who actually need to know all these things and need to be engaged, or to also represent their voices and actual concerns. But is there a better way to do that? I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think, again, it's a challenge, right? You need collective buy-in at the same time. I don't think it can be decided completely based on popularity, because otherwise people are not going to want to reinvest in these buildings.
I think part of it is like, it's a system that you're given, right? There's an ideal state where, where everyone has an opinion and we all commonly move towards this goal. But then there's the system we have where policy gets passed when you have the power to do so. And then when the next person comes along, they might do something totally different. And I think one recent example is the congestion tax in New York City. So for a while, they were saying, hey, it's coming in 2024. We're putting cameras everywhere. Get ready for this. And then at the last moment, the governor just nixed it. So now we don't know when it's going to happen, right? So you might have these political swings where you have policy kind of running up to this point until it becomes politically untenable to continue. And then our politicians will reverse course. So it is kind of the system we have. And even though these things might seem forced or might seem like, that they're done without potentially the vast agreement of people, it is an opportunity for some healthy pressure to be put on folks before the political atmosphere changes.
I think one thing to reconsider too, aside from the democratic nature of the West and America specifically, there's also a couple things that has going for it. One, America is a huge producer of oil. It has tons of energy. It also has a lot of land. It has a lot of space that it can actually capture a lot of energy too. So in terms of its own energy autonomy, it's pretty confident. If you look at a place like China, however, actually the imperative to move towards decarbonization is also extremely politically motivated. China doesn't produce oil. It has to get all its oil from other places, from Russia, from Australia, from the US, from Venezuela, Saudi, etc. And so if you look at the way that they're moving towards trying to electrify basically all their cars, and I was in China last year, I'm going again this week, you notice that there are a lot of BYDs. There's a lot of electric vehicles. Part of that is motivated by just the idea that they want to create an autarky. They don't want to have to rely on other governments or other countries to help fuel their economy. It has the benefit that, kill two birds with one stone of also creating a more efficient and more economically and environmentally resilient country. So in that case, you have an authoritarian government that can basically dictate things. But I do think that the buy-in is it's quite distributed just because of the scale of the country. And so in that sense, the way that you get things pushed forward is actually just through economic incentive. Basically try to drive the cost lower and lower and lower. And I think that China's doing that quite well with regards to sustainable energy, with regards to electrification of vehicles. I think the built environment when it comes to actually building and such is not sustainable. Like the amount of concrete that has been used in the country far exceeds the amount that has been used elsewhere. And you can say, well, okay, if I buy something on Amazon, I'm actually responsible for the carbon emissions of the factory that produced it in another part of the world. But China's real estate market is really its own responsibility. And I think that's one area where maybe, well, it's actually, you see the kind of collapse of that economy right now too. So there's some movement there in terms of how that might play out. But one thing I wanted to bring up is that and we use China again as an example, is because of the kind of growth of their cities, they haven't necessarily been developed in the most sustainable way. I think the emphasis, for instance, on spread rather than density has caused there to be a lot of building and a lot of building of infrastructure. Now, the reason why infrastructure was built in China is not just because to connect people. I think it's also for growth of the economy. But the consequence is that you have a lot of places that are highly impermeable. And so when you have a flood event, the water kind of stays above ground. It doesn't seep into the water table. And so there is this one idea called the sponge city movement, which is popularized by famous Chinese landscape architect Kong Jianyu from Turinscape. And it's been adopted by the ruling party, basically saying Chinese cities need to be more permeable. There needs to be more green space. There needs to be more trees, less highways, or at least amongst the highways and the buildings, there needs to be more trees. And I think in some cases, it actually works quite well. Trees are good because it eats up CO2. It also, you need a soft planting bed so that water can actually penetrate the ground. But maybe one of the consequences that were there, actually, I was reading in my interview before this, is one of the consequences that people are worried about is that actually it just might not be enough in the most extreme events. So if there is an increase of water, increase of rain in general, it can help accommodate this sort of flash floods. But in the biggest floods and the most devastating, the most kind of economically damaging ones, it just can't keep up necessarily. I think that the larger question is, okay, there are issues out there. How do we actually create policies and how do we actually create strategies that mitigate some of these things? I don't think there's a silver bullet though. And even in a country with as much economic might and manpower and labor and authority to do these things as China, you still don't have quite the solution yet.
Right. It's really a shotgun approach. Like, let's do everything that we can think of and see how much we can protect.
Yeah, I think this other thing is like, I don't know, I think there's this quote that's like, you can improve what you don't measure. And it's actually, I guess, really tough to measure these catastrophic weather events. And predict how they're going to get worse over time. So I think with a lot of these initiatives that you see get translated into policy is that they do need something that's tangible for them to latch onto. Things like square footage or, greenhouse gas, like I guess what is called CO2 equivalents. It's like you're taking all of these other emissions and equating them to kind of a CO2 equivalent. So you have one measure in order to drive policy around. So maybe that's where, again, like resilience is much harder to create policy initiatives around, because it's just like how do you measure the mitigated impact against a storm, a fire, a flood?
Yeah, I think if we think about it, there are sort of passive events that happen. So the increasing temperature of the air is just getting hotter and hotter in certain places. But then there are the sort of black sheep events like a flood or an earthquake or a fire that have devastating effects. So how many of those events might occur? And in the case of the worst event, what would the economic impact be? So, in the case of another superstorm Sandy, what happens to Lower Manhattan if it's not protected? Or in the case of an extreme fire in Los Angeles, what happens to the housing market there? And maybe there you can make some sort of economic argument for why resiliency, infrastructure, and planning needs to occur.
I think maybe that's part of the reason why those things happen much more at a city level, because it's tough to get incentivize individuals against some benchmark to upgrade their facilities. But as a city, you can build, large seawalls, retention ponds. I guess in the case of Sponge City, like large parks and tree plantings in order to do that mitigation. But I think another interesting, I guess, dumbbell issue is that your emissions are local. The impact of emissions are global, but the impact of storms and kind of the impact of your resilience moves are also local. So it's this, I guess, tough thing to balance, where when you're controlling emissions on one side and you're building resiliency on the other, it's not a direct one-to-one impact based on your locality.
Yeah. Well, you kind of have to walk and chew gum. So you have to do one thing. We're talking at the beginning of the discussion, we're talking a lot about how cities are trying to reduce the amount of carbon emissions that contribute to climate change. But now we're also shifting towards specific interventions that you have to implement in order to reduce the impacts of this climate change. So, I talked about Sponge City, but also, for instance, in San Francisco, I'm increasingly becoming interested in the waterfront and the coastal resiliency efforts that the city and the port is making. And so they actually put out a draft plan that's trying to reduce the impact of sea level rise by accommodating for basically anticipating up to 3 to 7 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. And what's interesting is their draft plan estimates a $13.5 billion price tag on sort of one of the options. But the Port of San Francisco is actually anticipating, and this is just a draft plan, but they would expect that the federal government is actually going to support 65% of that. As we talked about before, New York is an interesting example because actually the capital is in Albany, and so you have the state government oftentimes controlling what's happening in New York, but then you also have the federal government contributing to that pot. In the case of San Francisco, which is on the other side of the country, you do expect also the federal government to support it too. And I wonder what the case is that is being made. Like, is it simply that it's an iconic American city and you support it, or is it that it's an economic center and that's important for the general economy of the country? I sort of think that maybe because the way that things work in general is that the money is out there, right? And it's up to the state or the city, local jurisdiction to prove that it can actually implement and use the money in the appropriate way, and then it'll get distributed. So there is still sort of how America works, right? Like you have to ask for money, and then you have to say, okay, this is how we're going to use it, and it'll definitely be used this way, and then okay, then you get the money. But yeah, it is an interesting sort of distribution about how we have to actually prevent climate change, but we also have to prevent against the negative effects of it too. I think probably the solution or the best thing that you do is you try to accomplish as many things with one move as possible. Try to be efficient in that regard. And I think it goes back to your original point, Minku. Like, there's a lot of countries out there that are simply just trying to be economically viable and vibrant. And this is just another problem that's kind of hard to stomach. That's why I do think in America it is important that we do demonstrate some sort of capacity to take on the challenge, and then others may follow through.
Yeah. Well, those measures are being applied to by like tariff laws or like trading, for instance. So if you want to, for like batteries, if you want to supply batteries, if Samsung wants to supply batteries to Tesla, then they have to adhere to those sustainability measures that the US sets. In Samsung or any other conglomerate's case, when they're building these factories, they need to follow these standards that's related to carbon emissions and so on and so forth. But buildings don't get traded. Like buildings that you build in Korea is there for Korea. And
No, that's a
whatever
good point.
emissions that they bring, although it has a global impact, like the US isn't going to govern how the buildings in Korea would work. So I think maybe there needs to be like a international entity, which there are, but maybe they need to have more power to their legislation that requires governments, like countries, to follow.
We'll also get into this a lot more in the sustainability season, but the scope 1, 2, 3 emissions and the higher reporting standards you have kind of at the end consumer side, the more it's going to kind of trickle down to the upstream providers. So like you said, Minku, right? Like if Samsung wants to provide batteries to Tesla, they now have these compliance requirements that they have to undergo. They're probably going to have to require their suppliers to undergo these compliance requirements. So even if the building's built in Korea, right, its emissions kind of work into the supply chain that might have this downstream pressure that's going to push upward to help those buildings kind of have these more stringent requirements on emissions. And I almost think of it like, accounting in general, right? Like every company is going to have their accounting standard, but, if you want to list in the US as a public company, there's a standard accounting kind of practice you have to go under, you have to get audited. And as these kind of standards become more widely adopted, kind of more globalized, I think those things might also come into play where we get this, 1 or 2 common, a greenhouse gas accounting standard. Then, these giant, compliance companies will then come in and do compliance for you, and we'll kind of get a much more uniform application of those calculations across the world.
If cities also wants to be brands, right? And city, to a certain extent, are brands, and they do want to create a better image of themselves to attract tourism, to attract, in Korea's case, the birth rates are going lower and lower, and we need to be attracting foreigners, international expats to operate the country and the cities. So maybe in that case, there needs to be like a standard of that the cities can adapt and say that, oh, we're like a class B or like some sort of class something city. And that means that all our buildings are like net zero, carbon neutral. The city itself is carbon neutral. So maybe that could be a way of requesting these sort of requirements.
Sounds like ecotourism, but eco-urbanism. And I guess my fear is that you don't go to, say, Las Vegas because it's sustainable. You go because it's fun and you can gamble and you can do crazy things. And you probably don't care at that point that it's sustainable. I think you do go to certain places like Scandinavia, right? It's pretty cool how efficient and how everything works. So I do think it's already happening at a certain level. I just think you will have market leaders and you'll have people who just don't even want to play the game. Maybe one question is like, we talk about the downstream effects of supply chains. Are you going to have to demonstrate your, I guess, the energy footprint of your building in order to be listed on the NASDAQ or on the New York Stock Exchange or on the LSE or on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange? I think that might be an interesting thing too, because these corporations, corporate landlords, any corporation right now, especially if you're in manufacturing, but now if you're in tech, if you're in services too, like you do have a physical presence. And I suspect that maybe there are already sort of regulations on that too, but that might be a way to have sort of cross or global sort of legislation or requirements in a way that isn't, that is feasible. It's not just about saying you over there on the other side of the world, you must do that.
Yeah. Maybe if you want to be part of a REIT and publicly traded, you need to be a carbon neutral building. Maybe that could be a way.
No, I think
that
a
will
good
be
point too.
A large headache for the owners for sure.
There's got to be a green REIT. I feel like that must exist, but who knows?
Mm-hmm. There will be.
If not, we should start one.
If it's a good
green
idea.
REIT. Yeah. I don't know if the returns will be there.
I think maybe like going back to your city's point, I think there is, in a way, like an attractiveness to a city that has lower emissions, right? Like the air quality is better, the quality of life is better. I think you probably see that in Copenhagen or a lot of the like European cities where they do have it much more under control. And you can think to China where the air quality is terrible, but everyone has to be there for economic reasons, but it's a lot less attractive to tourism because you're just breathing in this toxic stuff on a daily basis. But I think another thing that cities are doing, and I think especially if you look at a lot of the climate action plans in the states part, is a lot of what they talk about, and I think this might also be a part of the US political atmosphere, is how many clean energy jobs that they're creating and how many clean energy jobs they're creating for traditionally disadvantaged communities. So it's not only about lowering greenhouse gas emissions, it's also about creating jobs for the work that is going to lower these emissions. And to your point about getting more people to come into the city, is like clean energy jobs are usually pay better. They usually have better insurance, have better kind of job security if we look at it, kind of into the future, and it's going to attract people into these places that can create these opportunities for us.
I'll give you one example of how sustainability is actually really beneficial. Yeah, as Minkyu mentioned, I'm in Hong Kong right now. Hong Kong actually has the highest life expectancy of anywhere in the world. And you wouldn't expect that because it's pretty tough to live here. It's really dense. Living conditions are very cramped. It's very hot. But I think, I was talking to somebody about this today, I think the main reason is because nobody owns a car unless you're ultra, ultra rich. And everyone takes public transportation. And so you're constantly on the move. Even just within the subway system, you have to actually walk quite a bit. It's not like the New York subway or the Paris metro where you just kind of descend. This one, so you start off on one part of the neighborhood and you end up on the platform, which is in the center. But people on the other side of the neighborhood are also making that trek underground. It's kind of out of necessity because it's actually air conditioned underneath. And so you have these sort of tunnel system that allows you to walk around. But yeah, I mean, that's a huge benefit actually, is having a situation where people actually live longer and they're healthier too. And Singapore does a good job of advertising themselves. It's a very healthy place to live, for instance. Japan is as well. The Mediterranean countries also. I mean, part of it has to do with lifestyle and food and nature and things like that. But I mean, there are severe, like really strong benefits. And, one of the major concerns a lot of countries have is when you have an aging population, how are you going to pay for the medical bill?
Yeah, but it's a lot easier if the aging population is healthier and they're more concentrated together, so you can build. So you have like a higher density to be able to create better facilities for everybody. And I think one thing in the U.S., especially if you look at a lot of very sprawl, very suburban areas, is it's hard to get the infrastructure together where they have all the specialized services necessary in order to take care of an aging population.
Yeah, I mean, density has its benefits. I think it's just really difficult because you can't just replace it. You can't suddenly densify or de-densify. Like it takes so long to change the built environment. And part of it is building housing, part of it is building infrastructure, part of it is just sort of economic change that occurs over time. But I don't know. Do you guys think there's a chance that places that should densify really will?
I think it's tough to say, but it's definitely one of the things to watch, right? Like you said, Alex, to build tall buildings, you do need more concrete, you do need more steel, you do need more carbon intense resources in order to do that. And with density, with more people, of course, comes more consumption that also is going to require more infrastructure. But at the same time, right, we do see the reduced reliance on private cars, the increased density being able to translate into more concentrated and more specialized services. Those kind of translate into more efficiency. So it's kind of a thing that we'll see whether or not it plays out, right? Like as some cities try to increase density in order to hit these goals, if it works, maybe other cities will follow along. And maybe if it doesn't, we might see a distribution of density even in order to, I guess, push out the responsibility of these emission targets out from kind of the main city center.
I think one thing that would really be great is if cities, the top 20 cities in the world, the top tier cities, if they can really get everything in order and really promote the idea of density being good, make sure they're clean, make sure they're efficient, make sure they're affordable. Maybe it's a paradox. It's not possible, but I think that whatever one can do to promote the idea of sustainable and healthy density, I think that's also beneficial for the planet as a whole.
Yeah, I think Boston has an amazing capacity to be, I think, double or even triple the density that it has now. But again, like we go back to this argument of how can we build? It's so difficult to build. So I think. Again, like the more we talk about this, the more I realize that everything is interconnected, and I don't know. The end of the discussion always is like, what can we do?
A lot of the places that are facing the most impact on climate change in terms of population are these giant coastal cities. So if we densify them even more, we increase their risk even more, right?
Yeah.
So even if it's more efficient to be dense, like, is that really the right way to kind of place more people at risk? And I think in a way, Chinese cities might be kind of the testing ground for this. They're super dense, they have a ton of people, and they have a way of governing that's able to implement these changes really rapidly. So that might be where a lot of things play out in the next 5 to 10 years that we can use as an example, good or bad, in order to implement changes for the rest of the world. Thank you for listening to the Most Modern Podcast. If you haven't already, please give us a follow or subscribe. If you like our show, please leave us a rating. Thank you.